Hi everyone, so I am Christophe Garcia, and today I will present to you synthetic user monitoring in the context of SAP Cloud ALMs for operations. Before starting, a quick usual disclaimer, just to inform you that the things presented in this presentation might be changed without notice by SAP, and this is not representing a commitment. Initially, this presentation was given and presented during the ALM Summit in EMEA in 2022. So today, during this presentation, I will give you and indicate to you what are the goals, what is the goal of synthetic user monitoring, what you can do with it, the first impression of how it looks like, and how does it work. Then very likely, I will conclude with some forward-looking information regarding what we envision in the future of the application. So the goal, synthetic user monitoring is a 24/7 monitoring solution to detect performance and availability issue of web applications from the client-side perspective. All those words are quite important to really describe what's the purpose of the application. With it, you will be able to define some scenarios based on the common usage, the standard usage of the end users of the application, the web applications you want to monitor. Those applications could be your own applications or third-party applications. You will be able to decide on which web browser to execute those scenarios. From those execution, we will monitor, synthetic user monitoring will monitor the availability and performance. This from the client-side perspective. This means that, for instance, in regards to the performance, the measurement also includes the rendering time on the browser side. Based on the execution of those scenarios, you will get a 24/7 monitoring for all the critical application you want to monitor, with the possibility to decide for the frequency, how often those scenarios have to be executed to monitor and to monitor your application and obtain the monitoring needs. We also give, in synthetic user monitoring, the possibility to have measurements taken from different locations, different networks, to pretty much simulate users from different locations located at different buildings or different areas. All that gives the possibility to early detect problems, sometimes even before the real users for the application notice them. Our UI gives the possibility to see the current, the immediate status of the scenarios we execute, but you also have the possibility to visualize data, historical data based on the previous executions to really have the impression of what happened over the time. In case something or a problem is detected, you have the possibility to drill down to get some more details about the execution that detected the problem. Because the monitoring is based on a scenario that is regularly executed, this will also give you the possibility to compare the evolution of the performance, the evolution of the availability for the application you want to monitor, and this relative to particular locations or not. So these are all the possibilities you can have with synthetic user monitoring. Quickly, how does it look like? When you click the synthetic user monitoring tile, it will open the application. And in this application, you will have one tile per scenario you monitor. You have the possibility to drill to the execution of the scenario. And then, as I explained, to drill to the details. The UI gives also the possibility to have all the scenarios side by side to compare their execution with or without expanded details. And you also have the possibility, under some conditions, to, during the execution of the scenario, capture some screenshots of the application you monitor. And those screenshots could be useful to better analyze what happened during the execution. Regarding how the application works. So this is a very simplified schema of a typical flow for the synthetic user monitoring. So all the monitoring is based on Selenium IDE scripts. This Selenium IDE script supports most of the web's applications. Synthetic user monitoring, once you have imported those scripts, are regularly executing them on what we are calling runners. These runners could be any Selenium remote WebDriver infrastructure. This is a W3C standard. And this is on the runner that you have the browser. So the browser that accesses the application you want to monitor. So pretty much this runner represents the end users you want to use to monitor the web applications. From those executions, synthetic user monitoring retrieves and collects some availability and performance metrics that are stored centrally into our databases in the cloud, and SAP Cloud ALM. And our UI gives the possibility to display those informations. So you heard me talk about scenarios, runners, Selenium, and so on. So as I explained earlier, this could have raised some questions on your side regarding those terms. I will try to answer at least some of them. Starting with scenarios and Selenium. So you heard me talk about Selenium IDE script, because this is the base of the scenarios for the monitoring. So Selenium IDE scripts are side file, side standing for Selenium IDE. This is the script that describes the series of actions that have to be performed or that will be performed onto the browser. So those actions are typically the clicks. So open this or this URL, click on this element, this button, fill in a given text onto a given input field, and so on, wait for such element to be visible, and so on. So this is really the description of the sequence of actions. Selenium IDE itself is an open source tool that you can install as a browser, by synthetic user monitoring to enhance the behavior, the standard behavior of Selenium IDE, in order to define some steps, to define some variables, to set some secured contents, and so on. After you created your script and saved them into a file, you obtain what we are calling a resource. So those scripts or those elements are what we are calling a resource when you upload them in synthetic user monitoring. One resource, one file, could contain several scripts. And these are those scripts that are interpreted and used by synthetic user monitoring to create scenarios out of it. So pretty much the scenario is the combination of a resource script containing in a resource and the runner. The resource script being the content, so the actions to perform, and the runner being the running infrastructure, the runtime infrastructure, so the web browser or simulating the user performing the operations. We measure from those executions for the scenario, the availability and performance, both globally and at step level. So maybe a few words about the steps. As I explained, a script is a sequence of actions. So when you will have created your script to monitor a given application, the script will contain a sequence of several actions, but you like to group those sequence of actions into logical blocks, logical groups. For instance, the login phase, or the access to this or this element, or the search for this or this functionality. For instance, talking about the login, the login in reality is composed of several actions. Yeah, you enter the user, you click enter, you enter the password, then you click enter, and finally you wait for the application to start. All those actions you can group into what, via the annotations, into what we call a step into synthetic user monitoring. This availability and performance metrics you can have both globally, so for the globality of the scenario, but also at the level of each steps you will have defined into your scenario. Regarding the performance, currently the performance issues are detected via thresholds. So as I explained earlier, you can define those thresholds at scenario or step level. You can define them manually, but we have also providing the possibility to have them set automatically based on the first successful execution. So this first execution will act as a benchmark for the thresholds for the following executions. Regarding the runner, so this is the scenario, yeah, it's composed of this Selenium IDE script, and it runs on a runner, one or several runners. So regarding the runners, the runner can be any infrastructure or component compatible with the Selenium Webdriver definition, yeah. So this is a W3C standard. So any infrastructure like that could be used as a runner, provided the synthetic user monitoring is able to access it. One of the constraints we currently give is that this access should be performed through an HTTPS URL, so an HTTPS connection. As I explained earlier, this runner represents the end user accessing the application you want to monitor. So we do not provide, SAP Cloud ALM do not provide this service. It do not provide this, this runner infrastructure. This infrastructure could be located at different locations, yeah. It could be on-premise, different technologies, or it could be also in the cloud, in your own tenants or in some third-party services. I will come back on that just after. In order to determine which kind of deployment, so cloud or on-premise or whatever you have to use, different factors have to be considered. Yeah, and it really depends on your situation, your landscape, the infrastructure you want to monitor, the subscription you might already have in place, or potentially the Selenium infrastructure you already have at home also in your company. So here are some examples of deployment along with the corresponding kind of application to monitor. So for instance, if you want to monitor an application on-premise that is into your private cloud, not necessarily accessible from the internet, or at least for which the main users are internal to your company, the most rational way would be to have the runners on-premise or local to your infrastructure. It's not necessarily that cloud runners are not possible. It's just that they are not maybe very relevant, or they are not really corresponding to the end users accessing to the application you want to monitor. On the other hand side, if you have an on-premise application visible from the internet, for instance, provided to some of your customers, in this case, you can use local runners, but also cloud runners are totally meaningful. And obviously the same applies for cloud applications. So pretty much the deployment for your runner depends on which kind of user you would like to simulate via synthetic user monitoring. A few words about the Webdriver infrastructure, because you might wonder what it is in reality. So it's pretty much a client-server architecture. In this architecture, the client is synthetic user monitoring running on SAP Cloud ALM. And this client talks to and sends the actions to be performed to a server, more exactly to a Selenium compatible server. This Selenium compatible server will operate the real web browser, so Chrome, Edge, Firefox, through the corresponding browser WebDriver. This trio of components, of elements, is what represents somehow the minimum remote WebDriver infrastructure. Yeah. So this is the minimum brick for a runner. Again, the only thing we have is that it must be accessible via an HTTPS connection. To decide to choose which WebDriver infrastructure to use, you have different possibilities. For instance, you can use the services of a third party dedicated to that. Some companies have their business, have as a business to provide such an infrastructure to other companies. In this case, they are taking care about the hosting, they are taking care about the infrastructure. So they are generally providing infrastructure with several kind of browsers, Chrome, Edge, Safari, and so on. They are giving the possibility to have parallel executions because they provision different systems and different machines, and they also provide different locations. For instance, they have entities and servers in Europe, but also in North America, South America, and so on, to represent different locations, different kind of users. You could also use and rely on an all-in-one package. For instance, Docker image. Yeah, so you can create a Docker image that will contain all the required elements. And in this case, obviously, you are in charge of the hosting, and you decide where you deploy the package, in the cloud, on premise. Depending on the package, those packages have some of those packages have the possibility to support multiple runners also, and parallel executions if required. And the last option is to have something that is really custom assembled. So in this case, you assemble on a host, for instance, a Selenium server, a web browser, and its WebDriver. So again, you are in charge in this case of the hosting. Web browser and WebDriver are very easy to find. Yeah, they are directly provided by the vendor of the browser. So for instance, Google provides Chrome, and besides it also provides the WebDriver for Chrome. The same for Microsoft. Yeah, for Edge, Microsoft provides the appropriate WebDriver, and so on. And regarding the server, you can use any ready-to-use server. So Selenium provides ones. Yeah, this is the one that is the most widely used, but the API is open. So in reality, if you might want to find some, you might look for some other implementation. Some exist. This is really up to you. Depending on these settings, the server, for instance, the Selenium server, also provide the possibility to have parallel execution. This is what they are calling the grid. So all these kind of infrastructure are supported by synthetic user monitoring. Okay, maybe now time for a little short demo. So, yep, just look like that. So yeah, when you start SAP Cloud ALM, you will start on this launchpad, and into SAP Cloud ALM for Operations section, you will have the synthetic user monitoring tile. When you click it, it opens such kind of UI, as I explained. So this is what we are calling the overview. So it's composed of tiles, and each tile corresponds to one scenario running on a given runner. For each tile, so each scenario on runner, you have the current, we display the current status in terms of availability, and the current status in terms of performance, along with some statistics related to corresponding to the time range currently selected. So by default, this is 1 hour. But if you change the time range to 2 hours, for instance, here you will have the statistics for those 2 hours. So for instance, you can see this scenario here was executed 13 times within the last 2 hours. All of them were in availability error. Because we had an availability error, the performance was not evaluated. And it means nothing to evaluate the performance if the application cannot be reached properly, or if the scenario cannot be executed till its end. This one, we had pretty all the execution were successful from an availability perspective, and they were all poor in terms of performance. Here you see some different cases. If you want to get access to the execution themselves, to more details about the execution, you click the tile, and it jumps to a second page, which is related to the execution. So when you click the tile, you have the scenario, and beside that, all the runners, the scenario is associated to. And here in this chart, you have 1 bar per execution, and then below for the runners, you have some more details. So each brick like that corresponds to an execution. If I zoom a bit, you will see you have a smaller bar here. This corresponds to the actual execution and its duration. So the longer this internal bar is, the longer the duration, the longer was the duration. And this big brick like that, this green one, corresponds to the validity of the execution. So an execution is valid until the next execution is planned to be executed, or until the next execution. So here I can easily see and quickly see that, okay, from an availability perspective, the execution was successful. The execution took a given amount of time, and this time was a bit longer than what is expected. So from a performance point of view, the execution was not so nice. Below that, you have some charts giving some statistical details about all the executions into the time range. So you have the availability distribution. So how often, what is the proportion, the ratio of successful execution and failed execution from an availability perspective. And you have a chart representing the duration of the executions. So this is the response side. This is more related to the performance. You can have all runners, but in case you have several runners, like that. But you can also see for one given runner. In this case, we are able to indicate color with a color what's the actual performance status for each execution. Because I jumped on this script, okay, I have a kind of breadcrumb here. If I go back, I will see all the executions in parallel for all the scenarios I have in my scope. And I will be able to see side by side which execution were successful, which were not successful, with the possibility to expand and see, get a bit more details about the duration, verify if some execution were skipped or not. If I want to get some more details, I have the possibility to select a given execution, and it will jump to the details of this execution. In this detail, I will find back all the steps composing my scenario, and I will have for each step the availability status and the performance status, along with the duration that was used, so the net duration that was used to evaluate the performance. I have also here the information regarding the global performance, so the overall duration of all the steps, along with the thresholds that were defined for the overall for the overall scenario. If some screenshots are configured, I also have the possibility here to see them and see exactly what the application looked like during the execution. So this is quite useful in case something does not and in case the scenario does not behave properly, or an availability issue happens, or whatever, you can see exactly what the UI looked like at the moment of the failure. By default, this is not activated because its screenshot represent a small amount of space, but all cumulated, it could quickly be quite big. So this is on demand. You can activate this at scenario level, which kind of screenshots you want to capture. I will come back on that just after. Okay, so this was for the monitoring part of the application. For the configuration part of the application, it all happens in the application itself from here. So here you can see all the elements, so the runners, the resources, the scenarios that are defined in my environment, along with some application settings. So the application settings, typically, you will find in here information regarding the data volume. So what's the space consumed by all the execution, the screenshots, and so on. You are also getting the retention period. So how long we are keeping all the execution, how long we are keeping all the screenshots. If you want to change something, you just need to click on the pencil here. It will jump to the edition pop-up. And here you will have the possibility to redefine the retention period. This is also in this screen that you can see the runners, that you can change the runner configurations, for instance. See what is the endpoint, so what's the Selenium remote WebDriver infrastructure that is pointed out by this runner. You can also here find the resources. So all the side files, the Selenium IDE files that were imported, and inside those files, all the scripts that were contained in the file. So as I explained, yeah, you can have several scripts into one side file. And finally, you have the scenarios from here. So where you can find, for instance, for each scenario, let me pick, for instance, this one. So you can find which runner the scenario is configured on. What are the performance settings? Yeah, so where the thresholds configured? So in this case, it was manually, but you have the possibility to configure them automatically on next successful execution, for instance. And you have the value for the thresholds. By the way, regarding the performance, it's not mandatory to enable it on each step. You can decide which steps are meaningful in terms of performance and exclude from the overall performance calculation some steps that are only used, for instance, to reach some part of the application, but not relevant for the monitoring you want to achieve. You have the scheduling, how often the scenario is to be executed. The minimal time for the scheduling is currently every 5 minutes. Yeah, so you cannot have an execution more often than every 5 minutes. But here you can define that. In case your scenario has some variable, you have the possibility first to see them here, and also to override the default stored values from here. And finally, here you have some information regarding the Selenium executions. So Selenium has some settings, for instance, to wait for some elements to be visible and so on. This is the location. You can redefine that. You can define which browser you want to execute the scenario on. In case there are some arguments, you can select them here. And from here, you can decide to activate or not the capture for the screenshots. So we have different kind of captures that are possible. You can define an automatic capture, for instance, at the end of each step, or you can define the capture only in case of error. So if the execution is successful, no screenshot is captured. But if the execution fails, then you will get some screenshots in order to better evaluate the problem. When you create the scenario via the annotations, you also have the possibility to explicitly indicate that you want to have a screenshot taken on after a given action. This is what we are calling the explicit screenshots. Again, by default, they are deactivated, but you can activate them from here also. Yeah. So this is pretty much the configuration of synthetic user monitoring currently. So far you got an overview of what the application is doing, how it works. You got also an overview of the UI. What I propose to you is to show you quickly how to create such a scenario, for instance. Yeah? So here I have another session for my browser. And as I explained, the Selenium IDE is coming as an extension, as a plugin for the web browser. So for instance, here I am in Chrome, and I have installed this extension. When the extension is activated, you will get this icon here, and this icon gives the possibility to start what is called the Selenium IDE itself. So this is represented by pop-up, and from this pop-up you can create a new script, reopen an existing one, modify one, and so on. A script typically looks like that. Pick one. So this is a site file, yeah, that was saved previously, and this is something like that. So for instance, you can have different elements in it, and the actions are looking like that. This is an open, set window size. You can have click on a given element, wait, and so on. If you want to create a new script, easy, you can define a new project. My project, for instance, is define a new Selenium ID project, so a new Selenium site file. And from here, you have the possibility to start directly and start creating and adding commands to create your new scenario. A new possibility, maybe I will just start from scratch to show you it's easier. When you open, by default, you can directly start with the recording. So you can also do a recording later on, yeah? So I will, again, my project, for instance, and here you indicate the base URL. So this is the starting URL for the application you want to monitor. Okay, for instance, yeah, the SAP role, and I'm starting the recording. Oops, sorry. And here you can see, yeah, the application, the URL I selected started. Okay, you see I'm in France, so automatically the UI is in French. But yeah, this is something that you can configure differently by specifying the appropriate URL and so on. And then, because I'm in the middle of a recording, Selenium is currently recording what I'm doing, I'm able to start performing some action. So for instance, I will search for BTP. Yeah. And you can see that behind the scene, Selenium started to record the action I performed. Yeah. I opened an URL. It decides for a window size, and then I clicked some icons, typed some text, sorry, clicked enter, and so on. So it records that. You have the possibility, for instance, like that. Okay, you can have also some additional actions like that are not clicked, like for instance, waiting for something. So for instance, here I want to wait for this text to be visible, yeah, to ensure that the page is loaded properly. So this is the recording capability. So all the actions are recorded like that. Okay, keep it simple. stopping the recording. It asks for a test name. Okay, and here it is. Yep, here I know that it expects a duration. So I have a scenario, like an embryo of a scenario that is created here, and the inside script for my scenario that is created here. I have the possibility to replay it to see if it works properly. I have the possibility when I replay it, to put some breakpoint to see what happened from a given moment, to check some elements. So for instance, check something, I can interrupt the executions, I can continue step by step. If I interrupted the execution, I have the possibility to perform some modification and then restart from here. Yeah, just to really create and edit my scenario. When you have something that is pretty much ready, you already have everything that is required for synthetic user monitoring to execute. In synthetic user monitoring, all those actions will be executed one by one by the server and sent to the runner. Each action is represented by a command. So Selenium supports several kinds of commands. A target. So this is the graphical element into the application where this action is to be performed. So for instance, when I have the type here, it's the type into an element that is the search form. Yeah. This target could be identified via several possibilities. Oops. If I'm doing like that, so you can you can let the tool select the target by itself. You can enter it by yourself. It supports CSS, it supports XPath. It's a bit of technical, but if you don't know how to do, you can either let the tool do the thing by itself. You can reselect, use this button here to reselect the elements by yourself on the UI, verify that the UI is pointing to the correct elements, and so on. So this is the tool itself. Now starting with, now that I have something in Selenium ID, I want, before putting that in synthetic user monitoring, to prepare a few things. So in synthetic user monitoring, as I explained, in a side file, you can have several scripts. The scripts are represented by what Selenium is calling a test suite. By default, it creates a default suite, but okay, I can have it and rename it by, okay, my BTP search. Okay, so this will be the name of the script, not the scenario, but the script. Then we have the concept. So those test suites contains tests, sorry. And I have the concept in synthetic user monitoring of steps. By default, the first step is the name of the test. So yeah, maybe I will rename it to entrance, because this is the entrance into the application. Okay, it opens the application and so on. And finally, it initiates a search. So maybe from this point, I want to create another step that I will want to name search. Yeah. So I have the possibility to, via an annotation. So the annotation is indicated into the description field of Selenium ID. This description field is not interpreted by the ID. So you can put any text you want. However, if you put a given sequence of text, for instance, like that, this is something that synthetic user monitoring will detect and will be able to interpret itself. So search. Okay, so this is, so here I will have two steps into my script, one which is the entrance, one which is search. And maybe, okay, here I'm typing BTP, but maybe I want to make it variable. So I can also indicate in synthetic user monitoring, okay, this variable equal query, for instance. Okay, and I want this value here to potentially be variable. So by default, it will be BTP, but in synthetic user monitoring, you might want to decide for another text to search. Okay, after I did all that, I can save my project. This will create a site file. Yeah. And this site file, I have the possibility to come here in the resource and upload. So synthetic user monitoring detected that I have one script into this site file, which is named my BTP search. Okay, here it is. And from it, I have the possibility to create a new scenario. So I will select my BTP search. Okay, I will make simple. I will just reuse the same name. Add. Okay, and now I have a new scenario. So I'm able to associate it to some runners. I see that I have two steps. Currently, I have no thresholds defined for it because it never ran. By default, those thresholds will be automatically set after the next successful execution. But if I want, I can proactively and in advance set some manual values. I have a scheduling, so by default, it will be executed every 5 minutes. I can change that if I want. It contains one variable that is named query. By default, it takes the value BTP, but if I want, I can put a different value. And in this case, at runtime, instead of typing the text BTP, yeah, if you remember your pin here, we enter in this field text BTP, it will enter the text I'm specifying here. Yeah. And I have the Selenium settings. Okay. So with that, I'm concluding my demo. Yeah. Quickly, a few words. Sorry. As I said, yeah. So regarding the next things. So what we envision for the future of synthetic user monitoring, many things. We would like to bring the capability to send events when something bad is happening in order to, for instance, to have alerting. We would like also to have the integration with business service management in order to first have synthetic user monitoring notified and inform when some services are not running, in order, for instance, to interrupt the execution and not raise some errors in case the underlying services, in case we know that the underlying services are already in maintenance, for instance, and also vice versa, to send some availability issue to the BSM to inform when synthetic user monitoring detected some issues. We would like also to integrate the aggregation of the data. Currently, we are only storing the raw data. We would like to also be able to store some aggregated data for a much longer period of time in order to, for instance, to provide some reporting capabilities. We would like to bring the capability to detect the performance issues via different means that just the thresholds we have today. So for instance, via outlier detection, seasonal adaptive thresholds, and so on. Yeah, and many, many other things. So yeah, we have quite some things in planning for synthetic user monitoring. Last word regarding everything I told you today, you will be able to find with much more information directly from the SAP Cloud ALM for Operation Expert Portal. Here you will find a section related to synthetic user monitoring. And from here you will find back all the information regarding the runners, regarding how to create some scenarios, how to create some scripts, some tips, and so on. So from here, you will really be able, this should be your central point of information for everything related to synthetic user monitoring, every expert data related to synthetic user monitoring. Okay, and with that, I'm concluding my presentation. Thank you, everyone.